Okay, so this is the section we're going to start talking about some of the more, I guess, more complicated parts of the molecular stuff that goes on a little bit. So we're going to start talking a little bit more about gas exchange. So we kind of introduced that a little bit in the last section, but here we focus on it a lot more. So we're going to talk about movements of gases across the membranes, movement of gases within the blood, and then we're going to talk about some affinity of oxygen to hemoglobin because the oxygen has to bind to the hemoglobin. That makes sense for us because it has to carry it. But you know, one other thing that has to happen is that hemoglobin at some point has to let go of that oxygen. So we're going to talk about how that takes place. And then we'll talk about the control of pH through ventilation. So the main way that your blood pH, and we're talking about blood pH, okay, the main way that your blood pH is taken care of is through a buffering system. Okay, so that's the fastest. However, that buffering system is actually made up because of or as a result of carbon dioxide levels. Okay, so carbon dioxide levels have a lot to do with blood buffering, and so you can change your ventilation rate and change your pH. So we're going to talk about that. It's a very important concept, and there's this calculation that we're going to use. CO2 plus H2O goes to H2CO3, right? Because these will all add up, 3 oxygen, and then that can be broken up into HCO3 minus plus hydrogen. And remember, when we're talking about pH, we're talking about hydrogen. Sorry, this is crooked. Um, so that means that as we have more carbon dioxide, we end up with ultimately more hydrogen. Okay, so I wrote this here because, and you're going to see it a few times because it's very important. It's very important you understand that. It's very important. Okay, so do you remember from the first section? Looks a little bit more complicated, but it's the same concept. We have external respiration that happens here. External because we're exchanging gases with the external environment, with the outside air, and so we call that external respiration. Okay, respiration. Okay, and so remember, everything's going down its pressure gradient. So we have more, and you can think of that in terms of concentration gradient. That's fine, but we call it a partial pressure because this part of your total pressure is carbon dioxide, and so carbon dioxide is going to go from a higher pressure to a lower pressure. That means that when you build up carbon dioxide from metabolizing cells, because that's what they do, the mitochondria releases carbon dioxide, then you have more in your blood, and so it's going to move down its concentration gradient and then out. And opposite happens with oxygen. Okay, so we're losing all of this oxygen, so it's lower pressure here, and so the oxygen moves into your bloodstream. External respiration, internal respiration, the exact opposite is going on. You're producing all of this carbon dioxide. All of a sudden, the concentration is higher than it is in your blood, and so it moves into your blood. Now, this is down at the cells that are doing all the work. You can think of it as like muscle cells or something like that that are doing all this work. They need more oxygen, so the oxygen is higher in the blood in this case than it is in the cells, so it moves into the cells. Okay, and then the carbon dioxide moves out. It's a nice little process. So again, a little bit of a review. Here we can see in the alveoli, we see oxygen moving down its pressure gradient. Okay, so we call that the partial pressure of oxygen. So it's moving down its pressure gradient into the capillaries. Okay, and there we can remember talking about the surfactant that's keeping this water from pulling everything closed. And then we have a layer of fluid that's directly under that. And then we have these very, very thin membranes. And so we've got the membrane, the epithelial tissue that's around the alveoli, and then we have the epithelial tissue that's around the capillary itself. And so we want to keep that as small as possible so these gases can move. And in fact, when we talk about diffusion and solubility, we can see that diffusion goes down a pressure gradient. Okay, in the case of gases, it goes down a pressure gradient. We called this a concentration gradient when we were actually talking about things, and now, or solutes, and now that we're talking about gases, we say it's a pressure gradient. So another thing that matters is solubility. Are gases soluble in water? Well, absolutely they are, because there's oxygen in lakes and streams in the ocean, because that's how animals, fish, get their oxygen, as they pull it out of the ocean. So yes, it is soluble. And then temperature for things to, so the more soluble something is, the better it's going to diffuse, obviously. And temperature, the faster molecules are moving, the more quickly they're going to diffuse. So the things that we need to worry about here are, and if we can think back to this picture, we want to move gases across these membranes. What's the quickest, easiest, best way to do it? Well, let's increase the surface area. So instead of our lung just being this hollow thing and, one little capillary being around it, we have a lot of little alveoli that are increasing the surface area inside there, and that's going to give us better gas exchange. So if we increase the surface area, we're going to, in a bulk scale, exchange more gas. It makes sense. The membrane thickness, remember we have those little epithelial tissues lining the lungs and the epithelial tissues lining the capillaries. And so depending on how thick that is, we're going to have better or worse gas exchange. The thinner it is, the better. The more quickly or the more easily these gases can move across it. And then the distance. So if we have the alveolus up here, and then our capillary is clear down here, that's a lot of ground to cover, okay, for these gases. So that's not going to be as good of gas exchange as if we have the alveolus here and the capillary right next to it. Agreed? Okay, so that's diffusion distance, how far it has to move. Okay, so the concentration gradient, we've been talking about this. It moves from a higher pressure to a lower pressure in the case of gases. But we can also think of it as inside here, if we have more oxygen, we have lots and lots of oxygen in here, then it's going to more quickly move out, okay, than if we had less oxygen in there, okay? So if we just have a few oxygen molecules in here, well, that's not probably going to be good enough, and so we're not going to have as much diffusion as we have when we have lots of them. Okay, so we say that's the primary factor affecting gas exchange. That's why we breathe the outside air. That's why we breathe heavier, because we want to get more oxygen exchange taking place. That's why we breathe heavier when we're exercising. Okay, so let's look at some of the issues that can happen. If we think of this is the alveolus, okay? This is the alveolus, or the alveoli, and this is the capillary here. Okay, so this is normal. Okay, so this is normal, a normal lung. This might be what you see. Of course, it's just a figure, but you can kind of get the concept. Okay, so that means that oxygen comes in here, and it has to diffuse across here and get into the capillary, and carbon dioxide, of course, has to do the opposite, okay, for external respiration. Okay, so what happens then if, for instance, you have asthma? Remember asthma, these smooth muscles that sit around here? What if they constrict? They constrict and they make this bronchiole very, very small, okay? They don't give it enough space, okay? So that means you're not going to get as much air in, and that's what happens with asthma. Increased airway resistance. You have more resistance. You just can't, the oxygen just isn't moving in the way it's supposed to. The air isn't moving in that's carrying the oxygen. It just isn't getting in there. And so that's going to decrease your alveolar ventilation. That means that you can't move the air. You can't ventilate. You can't inspire and expire the way that you want to. So there's going to be lower oxygen, lower partial pressure of oxygen. That's not good. Okay, pulmonary edema. Remember talking about edema, and we said that edema is just an increase in extracellular fluid, so the fluid can't get out of the extracellular space as easily. We talked about how that dealt with the lymph system, and the lymph is trying to scavenge that extracellular fluid. Well, let's say your heart isn't working the way it's supposed to, and so you have this buildup of fluid. It's not able to clear this fluid, okay? So you end up with something called pulmonary edema. You have a buildup of fluid, and when that happens, you've just increased the diffusion distance, okay? Remember I drew that little picture? Well, it's going to be a lot harder to move gases all the way across that distance. it's going to be a lot harder than if they were close, like we see up here in the normal. Okay, fibrotic lung diseases, damage can happen. Smoking, different diseases can cause damage to these, and it will cause some scar tissue. Um, and so we aren't able to, first of all, it affects compliance. I mean, that additional fibrous tissue will cause your compliance to be lower. You're going to be less compliant, sorry, because your lungs aren't doing what they're supposed to do in that stretch. But it also kind of forms a barrier. So when oxygen is trying to move through, it has a bit of a harder time moving through. It might bounce off first, and then have to regroup and then move through a different way or something like that. So you can kind of understand that that's going to affect how well you can breathe. So that means that someone with fibrotic lung diseases are going to have to breathe heavier. They're not going to be able to exercise as much because they can't get that exchange in this place. Emphysema destroys the alveoli. Okay? Remember, the alveoli, when we were drawing our lung a little while ago, the alveoli were giving us the surface area. All these alveoli in here were giving us lots of surface area for exchange. Well, if you destroy those, okay, so if those alveoli go away instead of being where they're supposed to be, then you're decreasing the amount of surface area, and so that means you're going to have less gas exchange, okay? All right, so you can look here. The partial pressure of oxygen is low during asthma, okay, because you can't get the air in. Pulmonary edema, you're breathing just fine, your alveoli are fine, but they just can't get the oxygen to the capillaries as well. This is normal too. Fibrotic lung disease, it could be normal, might be low, but even if it's normal, it's going to have a harder time, so that's going to cause your oxygen levels to be low. And this is very, very bad. That means if you're being chased by a cheetah, you're probably screwed anyway, but if you're being chased by a cheetah, you're going to give up. You're not going to be able to run as far, okay? Okay. Let's say you were a zebra. Okay, so here we have emphysema. Your oxygen levels may be low just because you don't have as much area for them to be there anyway, which is going to cause, which can also cause, or it could be normal, but because of that lack of surface area, your oxygen levels of your blood are going to be lower, your OSATs, or your oxygen saturation levels. Okay, so let's talk about solubility. Gases have different solubilities. In this case, we see carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is actually pretty soluble. Okay, so we can see that if the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air is 5.2 millimolars per liter, or millimoles per liter, then we can see that because it's fairly soluble, that in the gas, or in the liquid, in the fluid, okay, so this would indicate your blood, right? In the extracellular fluid and in your blood, you have about 3, okay? So it's a little more than half actually is dissolved and can move into the blood. However, oxygen is less soluble, okay? So you have the same amount, starting with the same amount, you're only going to have about that much, 0.15 millimoles per liter in the blood and in the extracellular fluid. That's a problem, isn't it? Because we want to carry that oxygen. We want to get it there. So what do? In the case of oxygen, we would have to, if it wasn't already there, invent a carrying system, but we have a carrying system, hemoglobin. So sure, it sucks that the oxygen isn't very soluble, but we have hemoglobin, and the hemoglobin will carry that oxygen through the blood for us. Okay, so let's kind of go through this checklist here. Carbon dioxide is more soluble in water. Okay, we buy that. The low solubility of oxygen in plasma requires that most of it is carried in hemoglobin. Okay, we mentioned that. What happens to all that dissolved carbon dioxide? Remember when we first started out, I said I wrote this equation up here? All of that carbon dioxide, or most of it, a good bit of it, we'll get the percentages in a minute, a lot of that carbon dioxide simply reacts with water to form something called carbonic acid. Okay? That carbonic acid can then form bicarbonate and it will produce hydrogen in the process. Okay. Now, this can be reversed, so these should be drawn as double arrows because it can go either way. If you increase the bicarbonate, you're going to increase carbon dioxide, okay? And that's going to lower the pH. Okay, so this is the blood buffer. So this is where, very important concept here, this right here in particular is where your carbon dioxide is hiding. Okay, so as soon as it moves in, your cells produce all of this carbon dioxide. It goes immediately through this reaction, and it is hiding in your blood as the blood buffer. It's very interesting. Okay, so let's talk first about the hemoglobin molecule. We've kind of mentioned this before, but this is the protein part. This blue part is the protein part. Okay, and then you have these four little heme groups. You have four of these. Four little heme groups in a hemoglobin molecule. This is a hemoglobin molecule. In the middle of each of these heme groups that are being held by this globular protein, in the middle of these heme groups sits an iron. Okay? And guess what that iron does? That iron binds to one oxygen molecule each. So that means that each hemoglobin molecule gets one, I'll try to see if I can make that a different color, gets one oxygen. So each one of them, that's not much of a better color, but each one of these gets one, there we go, gets one oxygen molecule. Okay. So that means that each hemoglobin gets 4 oxygen, and because each heme group gets 1 oxygen. Okay. Okay, so there are questions about that, I guarantee it, on the homework and the tests. Okay, so let's look at how oxygen is carried in the blood. Because it's not very soluble, a little bit dissolves and the oxygen moves down its concentration gradient, but it's going to build up pretty fast, right? Because it's not very soluble. So very, very quickly, most of that oxygen just goes boom, right into a red blood cell, binds to a hemoglobin, and then makes oxyhemoglobin. And 98%, good number to remember, 98% of the oxygen in your blood right now is bound to hemoglobin. Okay, that means only 2% is dissolved as plasma, and that stuff's probably on its way to becoming to moving in and forming a bond with the hemoglobin as well. Okay, so that's how it's carried. Okay, and then that hemoglobin will be released. We haven't talked about that the tightness of the bonding or the affinity of the hemoglobin to the oxygen, but then that oxygen can be released and move into cells. Okay, so what about carbon dioxide? Carbon dioxide looks a lot more complicated, and it is, because carbon dioxide is actually more soluble. But remember, and some of that can be bound to hemoglobin, so hemoglobin also binds to carbon dioxide, but only about 23%, less than a fourth, is bound to the hemoglobin. So some of it goes over here and forms this molecule with the hemoglobin, with the carbon dioxide bound to the hemoglobin in the same way that oxygen does. But most of it does this right here. This equation you have to understand. Okay? And that is the carbon dioxide reacts with the water, forms carbonic acid, and then that carbonic acid will split into bicarbonate and hydrogen. Now the hydrogen can also be bound to the hemoglobin. So the hemoglobin has lots of things that want to bind to it. Oxygen has the greatest affinity, so it gets first priority. But these other things can bind to it as well. Okay, so what that means, and this is the important thing to remember, is that most of the carbon dioxide that's in your blood is converted to this bicarbonate. Okay, and that is your blood buffer. The carbonic acid and the bicarbonate, that's what's buffering your blood. So if you have extra hydrogen, it'll just move in this direction. If you don't have enough hydrogen, it will produce more. Okay, I'll try to mention that again. Okay, so, and then dissolved 7%, which is more than the 2% of oxygen, but as soon as it dissolves, it's going to react with water because water is everywhere, and it's going to form this blood buffer, this carbonic acid and bicarbonate. Okay, so let's talk about what happens to oxygen. and oxygen binding to hemoglobin. So let's say that we increase, so down here we have our partial pressure or our concentration of oxygen. And so we increase the oxygen concentration. So we breathe and oxygen increases. And so this is how much is bound to hemoglobin on this side. So that means that as we increase the oxygen, more and more of it is bound to hemoglobin until it is saturated and we can't get any more in. So this is where we have saturation over here when we have all of the oxygen, the high pressure, the high partial pressure of about 100 millimeters of mercury of oxygen. That's when hemoglobin is saturated. But let's think of something else. Let's say that hemoglobin really didn't like oxygen that much. That means you're going to have to increase oxygen, and I'll make it blue. You're going to have to increase oxygen a whole lot, and hemoglobin's like, yeah, not interested, not interested. And then maybe after you've increased it a lot, it will finally take on the oxygen. So that's not very good. This wouldn't be a very good situation. Or let's say that hemoglobin was really, really attracted to oxygen, and so you just give a little bit of oxygen, and boom, the hemoglobin is just completely saturated. Let's think about this for a minute, because if your oxygen can become that saturated that quickly, how well do you think it's going to let go of that oxygen? I'm pretty sure that if just a little bit of oxygen and that hemoglobin's like, no, that's my oxygen, it's not going to let go of it very well. In this case, down here, if it doesn't have much interest in oxygen, sure, it'll let go of it fairly quickly, but it's also not going to carry it. So we have this nice middle line right here that says, yes, I am hemoglobin and I like oxygen, but you know, it's a healthy relationship. Okay, I can let it go if I have to. All right. So keeping that in mind, let's look at some things that have an effect on oxygen and the hemoglobin carrying capacity of oxygen. pH. Look here, if the pH is really, really high, the oxygen said the hemoglobin says, no, this is mine. Okay, this is my oxygen and I'm going to keep it. However, when it's kind of acidic, the pH is low, it's kind of acidic, it says, you know what, if you want that oxygen, you know what, you go ahead and just take that oxygen. Okay, why is this significant? Because around a cell, let's say you have muscle cells that are working really, really hard, what happens is it becomes acidic around those. Okay, they're producing more carbon dioxide. Remember, if you increase your carbon dioxide, you decrease your pH, so you're creating more hydrogens. Okay, so it becomes acidic around these muscle cells. These are supposed to be muscle cells. Okay, we can make them striated if you want to. Okay, so it becomes very acidic, which means that you're in this situation. So as the blood is moving through and the hemoglobin is carrying the oxygen and it encounters this acidic environment and it says, oh, suddenly I've lost my appetite for oxygen, so I'm just going to let that oxygen go. Guess who needs that oxygen? The muscle cells. Okay, perfect little system. You know what else happens when you're exercising? If we concentrate on muscle cells, when you're exercising, they get warm, they get hot. And you know what happens to the hemoglobin affinity? Affinity is just how tightly it wants to bind. It's like, you know, it's a little warm in here. I'm just going to leave that oxygen right here. I really don't have the affinity for it. I really don't care about it as much, so I'm going to leave it. And the muscle cells who are working very hard they say thank you very much. We can certainly use that oxygen. And then there's one more thing. Look, the amount of carbon dioxide. When there's a lot of carbon dioxide, the hemoglobin says, you know what, I'm going to keep this. Or when there's not very much carbon dioxide. Okay, so when the carbon dioxide levels are low, the hemoglobin says, I'm going to keep it. However, when the carbon dioxide levels are really high, again, your hemoglobin says, you know what? I don't care about that oxygen. I'll just let you have it. And the muscle cell says, thank you very much. We are producing a lot of carbon dioxide because we're working so hard, and we could really use that oxygen. So you have three things. You have pH, you have temperature, and you have carbon dioxide levels that all favor giving up that oxygen when you have a cell that's working very, very hard. Okay? Okay, so that's really important. Well, there's one other thing that happens to mom. Okay? Baby makes a little bit different hemoglobin. So the baby, when mom is carrying a fetus and she has a little baby growing inside her, and that fetus needs oxygen. That fetus can't breathe, so it needs to get oxygen from mom. If mom has very stubborn hemoglobin and says, "No, that's my oxygen," then then mom then mom is going to starve her little baby of oxygen. And so what happens is the fetus knows this and is very competitive, and it says, "You know what? I know you like oxygen, mom's hemoglobin, but I like it even more." Okay, so what are we going to do? Anytime mom's hemoglobin comes into contact or in the vicinity of baby's hemoglobin, or if there's an oxygen molecule, let's say there's an oxygen molecule that's just sitting here saying, "Gee, where am I going to go?" Most of the time, it will go to baby. Okay, so mom's getting her, she gets some too. But mom might have to breathe a little more heavily because baby is stealing this oxygen. Fortunately, baby doesn't steal too much, and so mom's okay. All right, so that means, so what that means for exam questions is that the fetus has higher affinity. Okay, and not just the fetus, but the fetus's hemoglobin. Okay, it's just a little bit different. That protein structure is a little bit different, and so the hemoglobin of a fetus has higher affinity than mom, and so that fetus can get the amount of oxygen that it needs. Okay, so any oxygen floating around in the extracellular fluid or that happens to pass into the uterus where the baby's growing, that baby will take that oxygen. Okay, all right. So what happens if we don't get enough oxygen? We call that hypoxia. It's a deficiency of oxygen at the tissue level. Okay, so that means the tissues, those muscle cells, aren't able to get as much oxygen as they need, or the brain cells, or whatever, the heart cells in case of a heart attack or something like that. So we have several different types here, and these are just terms that you need to remember. Anemia, anemic hypoxia, is when you can't get enough oxygen because you don't have enough hemoglobin, or you might not have enough red blood cells to carry the hemoglobin. So either way, you're not getting enough hemoglobin, you don't have enough hemoglobin, and so you don't have the oxygen that's binding to it. Okay? Ischemic hypoxia. Ischemia is an obstruction. Okay? Ischemic events is when you might have like little mini strokes or something like that, where you have a blockage and the blood flow is obstructed. And so all of those little tissues that are over here, all of a sudden, there's a block. They can't get the oxygen. Okay, so that's ischemic hypoxia. Now remember, and then we have some others, hypoxic hypoxia, that's just low arterial oxygen. That could happen when you just can't catch your breath at high altitude, something like that. And then histotoxic, that's just because of some kind of a toxin or poisoning. But these are the main ones, anemic, and ischemic. Those are the ones you're going to hear most about. Okay. Hyperventilation, we mentioned this in the last section too. Hyperventilation allows the inhalation of more oxygen and remember hyperventilation, in case you missed it, is just breathing fast. Okay, so that's ventilation that is fast. Okay, now we usually think associated with anxiety or a panic attack or something like that, but hyperventilation is just breathing faster. Allows the inhalation of more oxygen, the exhalation of more carbon dioxide. So that means your carbon dioxide levels decrease. Okay, what happens when your carbon dioxide levels decrease? What happens to the pH? The pH is going to go up because they go in opposite directions. Okay, so that means remember that association. Okay, this is an important moment here. Remember around those muscle cells, when they were producing all of that carbon dioxide, what was happening to the pH? It was going down. It was becoming more acidic. Okay, so that's that direct relationship, and that goes back to that equation that we saw earlier. I'm going to say more about that in just a second. Okay, so I want to mention this. This is something that's obvious, but the blood has chemoreceptors, okay, chemoreceptors that are constantly measuring many things. Well, let's just narrow it down to three. It's measuring your oxygen levels, It's measuring your carbon dioxide levels and it's measuring your pH levels. And guess what it does when it finds the oxygen levels low? It will increase breathing. So it sends a message to, and if we just remember this is the pons and the medulla, okay? The pons and the medulla, or the brain stem, okay? It will send a message to the brainstem, and there's this little area in the brainstem. It controls both the depth of breathing, inhalation and exhalation. Okay, we don't have to know all of these details here, but it will say, hey, let's make it faster and let's make it deeper because we need more oxygen. We don't have enough oxygen. Or it may say, hey, we've got way too much carbon dioxide. Same message will go here, and it will say we need to breathe more deeply and we need to breathe more rapidly. Okay, so what about pH? What happens if the pH is high? Okay, if your pH is high, you want to make your pH lower. How do we make our pH lower? We increase carbon dioxide. Higher carbon dioxide leads to a decrease in pH. Okay, so that means your breathing rate will decrease. If our carbon dioxide levels are low, okay, then that's going to lead to an increased pH, and your body will say, oh, wow, the pH is way too high. That must mean carbon dioxide levels are low. Okay. All right, so that means that if your pH is low, if your blood is acidic, what's that going to do to your breathing rate? I hope I didn't just say that backwards. But if your pH is low, important point to understand, that's going to cause you to breathe faster. It's very simple. It's because there's too much carbon dioxide. You have too much carbon dioxide, you're going to hyperventilate, or you're going to breathe faster. Maybe not hyperventilate, but you're going to breathe faster. So all of these things, these are pretty straightforward. The oxygen and the carbon dioxide are pretty straightforward. The pH is a little less straightforward because it sort of indicates that, because we know that if we lower our carbon dioxide, that we can raise our pH. So all we have to do is breathe faster, and we will raise our pH. It's fantastic. So I think about that when I take a breath. And we're going to say more about this here and relate it back to this this equation. But that's what I think about when you're sitting there and you just suddenly take in a deep breath, that maybe it's not just that you were running out of air. Maybe your pH had changed enough that your body said, oh, we need to dump some carbon dioxide, and therefore when our carbon dioxide levels go down, our pH levels go up. Remember, it's a direct difference. So low carbon dioxide means higher pH, and the opposite. High carbon dioxide means a lower pH. Okay? And it's because, and this is the equation that you have to understand, if I increase my carbon dioxide, I push this equation, because this equation can go either direction, but water's everywhere, so that's not a rate limiter, but the carbon dioxide is. And so if I increase my carbon dioxide, I push this equation this way, and what happens? I get more hydrogen. Remember, more hydrogen means acidic, and because the pH scale is backwards, people make this mistake all the time, and I'm so sorry that science did it this way. But as we increase the carbon dioxide, we also increase the hydrogen, which makes our pH go down, becomes more acidic. That's why it's this opposite, okay, effect. All right, so don't forget that, because that's an important thing. Your breathing, because that's what that really means, your breathing actually affects your pH. Okay? How rapidly your breathing affects your pH. Well, as things become more acidic, you get rid of carbon dioxide, your carbon dioxide gets lower, it increases the pH. It all makes sense. As those muscles are working and they're creating an acidic environment, how do we fix the acidic environment? If we just focus on that, well, we breathe heavier. We lower our carbon dioxide, which is going to lead to an increase in pH. Now, it also gives you more oxygen, which is good. But it's interesting how this pH regulation can happen in just this way. Okay, so the next section is going to be the renal section, so hopefully you understand this one. Good luck.